My name is Walter Hensley. I am 73 years old, and I have lived alone since my wife Marjorie passed away nearly a decade ago. Our house sits on the edge of Mason County, in an area most people only know from hunting maps. The dirt road ends at my front gate, and beyond that there is nothing but woods, miles upon miles of tall pines and twisted oaks, smelling of resin and damp earth. I have grown accustomed to the silence. After 40 years working as a forest ranger, solitude became a second skin. My routine is simple. I wake before the sun rises, brew black coffee on the wood stove, and listen to the old news programs that still come through on the AM radio. The voices are distant and crackling, like they are reaching me from another time. After the coffee, I go outside to check the rabbit traps and cut firewood. Some days I go from sunrise to sunset, without speaking a single word aloud. I like it that way. Marjorie used to say that the noise of cities was a kind of disease, and I think she was right. Here the only sounds are the wind brushing through the treetops and the crackling of burning wood at night. The house is old, but it is solid. The floorboards creak in the same places they have creaked for decades. The windows rattle when the wind picks up. The stove ticks as it cools. These sounds have become my companions. I know them better than I know most people. In the mornings, I sit at the kitchen table with my coffee and watch the light come through the trees. It arrives slowly, filtering through the branches in thin, golden streams. The forest never looks the same twice. Sometimes the mist hangs low, turning the pines into grey silhouettes. Other times, the air is so clear I can see the ridgeline 3 miles away. I do not drive much anymore. Once a month, I take the truck into town for supplies, canned goods, kerosene, batteries for the radio. The people at the general store know me by sight, but we do not talk much. They ask how I am managing out there alone, and I tell them I am managing fine. They nod and bag my groceries. That is the extent of it. I do not mind. Small talk has always felt like a waste of words to me. From time to time, strange news comes through on the local radio stations. Lost children, tourists who ventured too far into the backcountry, hunters who never returned. But that has always been the case in these parts. The forest does not forgive carelessness. Most of the stories end in tragedy. A body found weeks later, exposure, dehydration, a fall from a cliff. But there are always 1 or 2 stories that no one can quite explain. Disappearances with no trace. People who wander out of the woods days later with no memory of where they have been. Searchers who swear they heard voices calling from the trees, only to find nothing there. It was on one of those cold November mornings that I heard about the boy. 3 days missing in the woods. The search parties had combed the area around Dry Hollow Creek, which runs less than 2 miles from my property. They found him on the 3rd day, huddled beneath a fallen oak, alive and coherent. But what he told them afterward, that is what stayed with me. The boy swore that a creature had fed him red berries and kept him warm at night. He described it as tall, covered in dark fur and gentle. The authorities dismissed it as the hallucinations of a frightened child. The doctors said it was hypothermia playing tricks on his mind. I listened to the report while standing at my kitchen window, the coffee cooling in my hand. The reporter's voice was measured, professional, but there was something underneath it, a hesitation, a reluctance to say what he was really thinking. The boy had been found near Dry Hollow, a place I knew intimately. The terrain there is dense. The ground stays wet even during droughts, and the undergrowth is thick enough to swallow a man whole. No child survives 3 days in that kind of wilderness without shelter, not in November. But the boy had survived, and he had not been alone. I told myself it was nothing. Children invent stories, especially after trauma. The mind fills in the gaps with whatever it can. But something about the whole thing unsettled me in a way I could not quite name. I went about my day as usual. Split wood, checked the traps, brought in kindling for the evening fire. But the unease lingered, like a weight pressing against the back of my skull. That night, I fed the stove and sat in the armchair by the window, watching the darkness settle over the trees. The moon was a thin crescent, barely visible through the clouds. The air outside was still cold and heavy with the smell of wet leaves. I could hear the distant hooting of an owl, and somewhere farther off, the yipping of coyotes. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, but underneath them, I thought I heard something else. A low, rhythmic rustling, like something large moving through the underbrush. I stood and walked to the back door, pressing my ear against the wood. The sound stopped. I waited, listening to the silence, feeling the cold seeping through the door frame. After a long moment, I turned the lock and went back to the fire. But I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the boy, alone in the woods and whatever had kept him alive. I kept thinking about the way the reporter had paused before reading the child's account, as if he were afraid to say the words out loud. And I kept thinking about the forest beyond my door. The miles of trees and shadows, the places where the light never quite reaches, the deep, ancient stillness that lives in the spaces between the sounds. I have spent my entire life in these woods. I know them as well as any man can. But that night, for the first time in decades, I felt like I was being watched. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each second with mechanical precision. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. I added another log to the fire and tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. Eventually, I gave up and just sat there staring into the flames, listening to the house settle around me. And somewhere, far off in the darkness, I thought I heard a branch snap, sharp and sudden, like a gunshot in the silence. I did not go outside to check. Some instincts, even after all these years, and still run deep. At first, I did not give it much thought. Children invent stories, especially after they have been hungry and frightened. The mind is a strange thing. It fills in the blank spaces with whatever it needs to survive. I have seen it before, in my years working the backcountry. People who got lost and swore they saw lights in the trees, voices calling their names, shadows that moved against the wind. Most of it is exhaustion, dehydration, fear-twisting perception into something else. But something in the reporter's voice had stayed with me, lodged somewhere deep in my chest like a splinter I could not reach. The boy had been found near Dry Hollow Creek, less than 2 miles from where I stood. I knew that area better than I knew my own reflection. The terrain there is unforgiving. Thick undergrowth, steep slopes, soil that stays wet year-round and sucks at your boots with every step. The creek itself is narrow and shallow, running cold even in summer, fed by springs that bubble up from deep underground. It is not the kind of place where a child survives 3 days without help. Not in November. Not when the nights drop below freezing, and the mist clings to the ground like a living thing. I tried to put it out of my mind. There was work to do. Firewood to split, traps to check, the roof on the shed that needed patching before the real winter set in. I kept myself busy, the way I always have. Movement is its own kind of answer. But the unease did not leave. It followed me through the day like a shadow, quiet and persistent. That evening, after the sun had dropped behind the ridge and the temperature fell sharply, I stood at the kitchen sink washing my coffee cup. The window above the sink faces the back of the property, where the yard gives way to the tree line. The light was almost gone, just the faint purple glow of dusk clinging to the horizon. I was rinsing the cup when I heard it, a heavy, dragging sound coming from the back porch. I set the cup down carefully and wiped my hands on the towel. My heart had started to beat faster, a low, steady thrum in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. A raccoon, a possum, maybe a deer wandering too close to the house. But the sound was wrong. Too deliberate, too heavy. I stood there for a long moment, listening, feeling the cold air seeping through the cracks around the window frame. I reached for the flashlight hanging by the door and picked up the shotgun from the corner. The weight of it was familiar, comforting in a way that nothing else could be. I unlocked the back door and stepped out onto the porch, sweeping the beam of light across the yard. The air was still, cold enough to burn my lungs, and the smell of damp earth was thick and cloying. The bowls I left out for the raccoons were overturned, their contents scattered across the boards. That was not unusual. But then I saw the tracks. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot prints, wide and deep, pressed into the soft mud near the porch steps. The edges were ragged, smeared, as if whatever made them had paused there, shifting its weight from one foot to the other. The pattern was deliberate, almost methodical. The tracks circled the house, moving along the side of the porch and disappearing into the grass near the woodpile. I stood there, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, my breath fogging in the cold. My hands were steady on mice, but my mind was racing. I have tracked animals my entire life. I know the difference between a bear and a man, between a deer and a dog. These tracks were neither. They were too large, too oddly shaped, and the spacing between them suggested something that walked upright, with a stride longer than any human's. I followed the tracks to the edge of the yard, where the grass met the tree line. They continued into the woods, pressed into the carpet of pine needles and dead leaves. But I did not follow. Some part of me, the part that had kept me alive in the backcountry for 40 years, told me to stop, to turn around, to go back inside and lock the door. I did. I went back to the house, closed the door behind me and slid the bolt into place. Then I stood in the kitchen, the shotgun still in my hands, listening. The house was silent. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second falling into the next with the same mechanical certainty. Outside, I heard a sharp crack, the unmistakable sound of a thick branch snapping under weight. It was not close, but it was not far either. Somewhere out there, just beyond the reach of the porch light, something had moved. I set the shotgun down and sat at the kitchen table, my hands folded in front of me. The rational part of my mind was working through possibilities. A bear, maybe. They get bold sometimes, especially in the fall when they are fattening up for winter. But the tracks were wrong. The size was wrong. The spacing was wrong. And the way they circled the house. That was not how a bear behaves. Bears are curious, but they are also cautious. They do not linger. They do not study. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat there as the night deepened around me. The minutes passed slowly, marked by the ticking clock and the occasional pop from the wood stove. I did not turn on the lights. I just sat in the near darkness, the glow from the stove casting long shadows across the walls mount, and waited. For what I was not entirely sure, but waiting felt like the only reasonable thing to do. Around midnight, I heard it again, footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the woods beyond the house. They were heavy enough that I could feel the faint vibration through the floor, a deep, rhythmic thudding that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood and moved to the window, careful not to make any noise, and peered out into the darkness. The moon had risen, pale and distant, casting a thin silver light over the yard. The trees stood black and motionless, their branches stark against the sky. I could see the edge of the woods, the place where the tracks had disappeared. And then, for just a moment, I thought I saw movement and a shape, tall and broad-shouldered, standing just inside the tree line. It was too dark to make out details, but I could feel it watching, waiting. I do not know how long I stood there. Time seemed to stretch and compress, bending around me like water around a stone. Eventually, the shape moved, or I thought it did, slipping deeper into the trees until it was swallowed by the darkness. I stayed at the window for another hour, watching, but I saw nothing else. That night I did not sleep. I sat in the armchair by the stove, the shotgun across my lap, and listened to the house breathing around me. Every creak, every groan of the old wood sounded amplified, foreign, as if the house itself had become something I no longer recognized. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending dry leaves skittering across the porch. But underneath the wind, I thought I could still hear those footsteps, distant now, fading into the forest, but unmistakable. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted but too wired to rest. I made more coffee and stood at the back door, looking out at the yard in the grey morning light. The tracks were still there, pressed into the mud, leading from the porch to the woods and back again. I walked out to examine them more closely, kneeling in the cold dirt, running my fingers along the edge of one of the prints. The soil was pressed down hard, compacted by something heavy. The shape was vaguely human but distorted, the toes too long, the heel too wide. I stood and looked toward the trees, toward the place where I had seen the shape standing in the darkness. The forest was silent now, wrapped in the quiet stillness of early morning. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, its voice harsh and lonely. I thought about the boy again, lost for 3 days and found alive. I thought about what he had said, that something had fed him, kept him warm, protected him, and I thought about the tracks circling my house, the deliberate, almost careful way they moved, as if whatever made them was studying me, learning the shape of my life. I went back inside and locked the door. But the unease stayed with me, a constant hum beneath my thoughts, like a frequency I could feel but not quite hear. 2 days passed before I decided to check the trail cameras. I keep them strapped to trees throughout the property, more out of habit than any real expectation. They are old, reliable models that I have used for years, motion-activated, infrared-capable, designed to capture whatever moves through their field of view. Over the years, they have recorded deer, bears, coyotes, the occasional mountain lion passing through on its way to somewhere else. The footage is usually unremarkable, animals moving through the frame, pausing to sniff the air, then continuing on. But I check them regularly, part of the same routine that has governed my life for decades. That morning, I walked out to the nearest camera, mounted on a pine tree about 200 yards from the house, overlooking a game trail that runs parallel to Dry Hollow Creek. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of frost and decaying leaves. The light was thin and grey, filtered through a low ceiling of clouds that seemed to press down on the world. My breath formed small clouds that hung in the air for a moment, before dissipating. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of my boots crunching through the frost-covered grass. I unstrapped the camera from the tree and carried it back to the house. The memory card was full, which was not unusual. So I took it inside and sat at the kitchen table with Marjorie's old laptop, a machine she used to use for emailing her sister and looking up recipes. It is slow and outdated, but it still works, and that is all I need. I inserted the card into the reader and opened the folder. The files were organized by date and time, each one a short clip triggered by movement. I started from the beginning. The first few clips were exactly what I expected. A doe and her fawn passing through just after dawn, a raccoon investigating the base of the tree, a crow landing on a low branch, cocking its head as if considering the camera, then flying off. Normal, unremarkable, the kind of thing I have seen 1,000 times before. But then I reached a file time-stamped at 2:47 in the morning, 3 days prior. The night after I'd found the tracks, the screen went dark as the clip loaded, and then the image appeared, the familiar view of the game trail, rendered in the ghostly grayscale of infrared. The trees were pale and skeletal, their branches stark against the black sky. For a moment, nothing moved. And then, from the left side of the frame, a shape emerged. It walked into view slowly, moving with a deliberate, almost measured gait. The figure was massive, far too large to be a man, far too upright to be a bear. It stood easily over 8 feet tall, with broad, powerful shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. Its body was covered in dark fur, thick and shaggy, catching the infrared light in a way that made it look almost textured, three-dimensional. The proportions were wrong, unsettling. The limbs were too long, the torso too thick, the head too small and rounded in comparison to the rest of the body. But what stopped my breath was the face, or rather the eyes. The creature paused directly in front of the camera, no more than 10 feet away, and turned its head toward the lens. For a moment, just a single, frozen moment, its eyes reflected the infrared light, glowing with a deep, wet red. They were not the flat, reflective eyes of an animal. There was something behind them, something aware. It looked directly at the camera, not past it, not around it, but at it, as if it knew it was there, as if it understood what it was. And then, just as slowly as it had appeared, it turned and walked out of frame, disappearing back into the darkness. The clip ended. The screen went black. The timestamp blinked in the corner, 2 minutes and 17 seconds. I sat there staring at the laptop, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking. I replayed the clip, once, twice, 3 times. Each time the result was the same. The creature, tall and covered in fur, walking through the frame with that strange, deliberate gait. The eyes, glowing red in the infrared light, staring directly into the camera. The awareness in that gaze, the intelligence. I tried to rationalize it, tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a distortion caused by the angle or the infrared rendering. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, or a man in some kind of costume. But even as I thought it, I knew it was not true. I have seen bears. I have seen men. This was neither. The size was wrong. The movement was wrong. The proportions were impossible. And the eyes, those eyes that looked directly into the camera with something that felt uncomfortably close to understanding. Those were not the eyes of any animal I had ever seen. I spent the rest of the morning sitting at the table, the laptop open in front of me, replaying that clip over and over. I studied every frame, looking for some explanation, some detail that would make sense of what I was seeing. But the more I watched, the less sense it made. The creature moved with a fluidity that was almost graceful, despite its size. Its steps were deliberate, placed with a precision that suggested familiarity with the terrain. And when it paused in front of the camera, there was a stillness to it, a kind of patient watchfulness that felt intentional. That afternoon, I called an old colleague from my ranger days. Bill Hutchins. We worked together for nearly 15 years, covering the same territory, sharing the same responsibilities. If anyone would understand, it would be him. I told him I had something unusual on one of my trail cameras, something I wanted him to look at. He agreed to stop by the next day. When Bill arrived, I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table while I loaded the clip. He watched it in silence, his expression neutral, his eyes fixed on the screen. When it finished, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he smiled, a small, uncomfortable smile, and shook his head. He told me it looked like a camera malfunction, a glitch, maybe some condensation on the lens, or a reflection from the infrared light distorting the image. He said that trail cameras do strange things sometimes, especially in cold weather. He suggested I clean the lens and reset the camera, see if the problem persisted. He said I might be spending too much time alone out here, that isolation could play tricks on the mind. He said it kindly, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the polite skepticism. After he left, I realized I would not be showing the footage to anyone else. People do not want to believe in things that do not fit into their understanding of the world. They need explanations, rational answers, comfortable certainties. And when those are not available, they dismiss what they cannot explain. They call it a malfunction, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by loneliness. It is easier that way. But I knew what I had seen. I knew the weight of that gaze, the intelligence behind those eyes. I knew the way the creature had moved, deliberate and aware, as if it understood not just the forest but the boundaries of my world. And I knew, with a certainty that felt like cold water running through my veins, that it had been watching me. Not by accident, not in passing, but intentionally, carefully. I deleted the file from the laptop, not because I doubted what I had seen, but because keeping it felt dangerous in a way I could not articulate. It was evidence of something that should not exist, and evidence has a way of demanding action, explanation, exposure. I was not ready for any of that. I wanted only to understand what was happening, to make sense of the presence that had entered my life, uninvited and incomprehensible. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. The wind moved through the trees outside, a low, constant whisper. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint, mournful cry of an owl, and underneath it all, barely perceptible, I thought I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the house in the darkness. I did not get up to look. I did not reach for the flashlight or the shotgun. I just lay there, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me, and wondered what it wanted, why it was here, what it saw when it looked at me through the lens of the camera, its eyes glowing red in the infrared light. The boy had said it fed him, kept him warm, protected him, and I wondered, lying there in the darkness, if that was true. If this thing, whatever it was, had some capacity for care, some instinct toward preservation, or if the boy had simply been lucky, spared by chance or circumstance from something far worse. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake until the first grey light of dawn crept through the window, and even then I could not shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting, learning. After that night, everything changed. Not all at once, but gradually, the way a slow poison works its way through the bloodstream. The nights were no longer simply dark. They became something else, something heavier, more aware. I would sit in my chair by the stove, reading or pretending to read, and the silence would press against the windows like something alive, something waiting. The familiar sounds of the house, the creaking floorboards, the ticking clock, the pop and hiss of burning wood, all began to feel different, as if they were being listened to by something other than me. I started hearing the footsteps regularly, always after midnight, always slow and deliberate, moving through the woods beyond the fence line. They would approach the edge of the property and then stop, as if respecting some invisible boundary. Sometimes they would stay there for what felt like hours, just beyond the reach of the porch light, a presence I could feel but not see. Other times they would move in a wide circle around the house, methodical and patient, before retreating back into the forest. The first few times, I went to the window with the flashlight and tried to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. But the beam of light never revealed anything except trees and shadows, and the faint reflection of animal eyes that scattered as soon as the light touched them. Raccoons, possums, deer, frozen in mid-step. Normal things. But the footsteps were not normal, and they did not stop just because I was looking. One night, around 2 in the morning, I heard something else. A whistle. Long and low and almost melodic, rising from the direction of Dry Hollow Creek. It sounded human, but not quite. The pitch was too steady, the tone too pure, like a note held by someone with more breath than any person should have. It lasted for nearly 10 seconds, echoing through the trees, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves, just that vast, empty quiet that makes you aware of how small you are, how fragile. I stood at the back door with my hand on the bolt, listening. My heart was beating fast, a dull hammer in my chest. The whistle did not repeat, but I could feel something out there, waiting in the darkness, as if it had called and was now listening for an answer. I did not answer. I went back to my chair and sat with the shotgun across my lap until the sky began to lighten and the ordinary sounds of morning returned, birds calling, the wind stirring the branches, the distant hum of a truck on the county road. I thought about calling someone. The sheriff, Bill Hutchins again, anyone. But what would I say? That I heard footsteps in the woods, that something whistled at me in the night. They would tell me the same thing they told me before, that I was imagining things, that isolation was making me paranoid, that old men living alone start to see patterns where there are none. And maybe they were right. Maybe I was losing my grip. But the footsteps were real. The whistle was real. The tracks in the mud were real. And the creature on the trail camera, that was real too, no matter how many times I tried to explain it away. So I said nothing. I kept the doors locked and the shotgun loaded and went about my routine as if everything were normal. Coffee at dawn, wood splitting in the morning, checking the traps in the afternoon. But the routine felt hollow now, like going through the motions of a life that no longer fit. Everything that had once been familiar, the light through the kitchen window, the sound of wind in the pines, the smell of wood smoke, now carried an edge of strangeness, as if the world I had known for 73 years had shifted slightly out of alignment. The worst part was not the fear itself, but the way it changed how I moved through my own life. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the air, every shadow that moved at the edge of my vision. I stopped going into the woods alone. I stopped checking the far traps. I stopped walking down to the creek to fill the water jugs. The house, which had always felt like a refuge, began to feel like a cage. And the forest, which had been my home for decades, became something foreign and hostile, a place where I no longer belonged. I tried to maintain my sanity through the small rituals that had always sustained me. Coffee at 6, firewood at 8, reading in the evening. But even the books seemed useless now. I would read the same page 3 or 4 times without absorbing a single word. The sentences blurred together, meaningless strings of letters that could not hold my attention. My mind kept drifting back to the window, to the darkness beyond the glass, to the presence I could feel but not see. One evening, I was sitting at the table with a cup of cold coffee and an open book I was not reading when I felt it, a faint vibration through the floor, so subtle I almost missed it. It was not like the rumble of a truck on the road or the distant thud of a tree falling. It was rhythmic, steady, like the beating of a very large heart, or like footsteps, heavy footsteps, moving slowly through the trees, close enough that the ground itself registered the weight. I set the book down and stood, my legs stiff from sitting too long. The vibration continued, a barely perceptible tremor that seemed to pulse through the walls and floor. I moved to the window and looked out into the gathering dusk. The trees were dark silhouettes against the fading light, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I could see the fence line, the edge of the yard, the beginning of the woods, but I could not see anything moving. The vibration stopped. The silence rushed back in, thick and oppressive. I stood at the window for a long time, watching, waiting, my breath fogging the glass. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A shape, barely distinguishable from the shadows around it, standing at the edge of the tree line, tall, broad-shouldered, motionless. My heart seized in my chest. I could not move, could not breathe, could not look away. The shape stood there for what felt like an eternity, a dark mass against the darker forest, and I had the distinct impression that it was looking back at me. Not with hostility, but with something else. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. As if we were two creatures studying each other across a divide that neither of us fully understood. And then it was gone. Not walking away, not moving through the trees, just gone, as if it had simply dissolved into the darkness. I blinked, and the space where it had been was empty, indistinguishable from the rest of the forest. I stood at the window until full night had fallen, until the glass reflected only my own pale face staring back at me. Then I closed the curtains, locked every door and window, and sat in the chair by the stove with the shotgun in my hands. I did not sleep. I just sat there, listening to the house breathe around me, feeling the weight of the night pressing down like a physical thing. The sheriff came by a few days later, not because I called him, but because someone in town had mentioned that I had not been seen in a while. He was a young man, earnest and well-meaning, with a pressed uniform and polished boots. He asked if I was doing all right, if I needed anything, if I had been feeling well. I told him I was fine, just keeping to myself like always. He looked around the kitchen, at the stacks of firewood by the door, at the shotgun leaning against the wall, and nodded slowly. He asked if I had seen anything unusual, heard any strange noises. I thought about telling him, about the footsteps, the whistle, the shape at the edge of the woods, but I could see the way he was looking at me, with that careful, gentle concern that people use when they think you might be losing your mind. So I told him no, nothing unusual, just the regular sounds of the forest. He left his card on the table and told me to call if I needed anything. After he drove away, I tore the card into small pieces and threw them in the stove. There was no point in calling. No one could help me with this. No one would even believe me. And maybe that was for the best. Some things are not meant to be shared. Some experiences exist only in the space between one person and the inexplicable. And bringing others into that space only diminishes it, makes it smaller and more ordinary than it really is. So I stopped trying to make sense of it. Stopped trying to explain it or rationalize it or fit it into some framework of understanding. I simply accepted that there was something in the woods, something that watched me and circled my house and whistled in the darkness. I accepted that it was real, whatever it was, and that I was living alongside it whether I wanted to or not. And in a strange way, that acceptance brought a kind of peace, not comfort exactly, but a resignation, a recognition that my life had changed, that the world I thought I knew had revealed a deeper layer, and that I was now a witness to something most people would never see or believe. It was isolating. It was terrifying. But it was also, in a way I could not quite articulate, profound. Winter came early that year. By mid-December, the ground was covered in a thick blanket of snow that muffled every sound and turned the world into something clean and featureless. The trees stood bare and skeletal against the grey sky, their branches weighted down with ice that caught what little light managed to filter through the clouds. The cold was brutal, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there, aching in every joint, making even simple movements feel laborious. I kept the stove burning day and night, feeding it log after log until the metal glowed dull red. The house was warm, but outside, the temperature dropped below zero most nights. The creek froze solid, a ribbon of white cutting through the forest. The snow was so deep that walking anywhere required effort, each step sinking knee-deep into the powder. I stopped going out except to bring in firewood from the stack on the porch. Everything else could wait until spring. It was on one of those frozen nights, maybe 2 weeks before Christmas, that I heard the sound of metal being twisted. I was half asleep in the chair by the stove, the shotgun balanced across my lap, when the noise jolted me awake. It was loud, violent, the screech of metal bending under tremendous force, followed by a heavy thud that shook the walls. I stood so quickly that the shotgun clattered to the floor, My heart was racing, adrenaline flooding my system. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and moved to the front window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see out. The beam of the flashlight swept across the yard, catching the snow in 1,000 tiny reflections. And there, lying in the snow near the fence, was my radio antenna, or what was left of it. The metal pole had been torn from its mounting on the roof and bent nearly in half, as if something had simply reached up and crushed it with its bare hands. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. The antenna had been bolted to the roof with heavy-duty brackets. It would have taken significant force to remove it, let alone bend it. No wind could do that, no animal. Not even a man, not without tools. I do not know what possessed me to go outside. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe some part of me had simply had enough of hiding, of cowering inside while something circled my life like a predator studying its prey. Whatever the reason, I pulled on my coat, grabbed the flashlight, and opened the front door. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The air was so frigid it burned my lungs, and my breath came out in thick clouds that hung in the stillness. The snow crunched under my boots as I stepped off the porch and walked toward the antenna. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted metal, the deep impressions in the snow where something heavy had stood. And then I smelled it. A thick, pungent odor, musky and organic, like wet fur and damp earth and something else I could not identify. It was strong enough to make my eyes water, strong enough that I could taste it on the back of my tongue. I swung the flashlight toward the tree line, and that is when I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the woods, maybe 30 feet away. Tall. Impossibly tall. Its shoulders were massive, its arms hanging down past its knees, and its entire body was covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. But what stopped me, what froze the breath in my lungs and made my heart stutter in my chest, were the eyes. They caught the beam of the flashlight and reflected it back, glowing with that same deep, wet red I had seen on the trail camera. They were looking directly at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. With recognition, with awareness, we stood there, facing each other across the snow, neither of us moving. The world had gone completely silent. No wind, no animals. No sound except the hammering of my own pulse in my ears. I could see its breath rising in the cold air, slow and steady, each exhalation forming a cloud that dissipated into the darkness. It was breathing. It was alive. It was real. I do not know how long we stood there. Time seemed to collapse, to fold in on itself. Seconds stretched into minutes. Or maybe it was only seconds that felt like hours. The creature did not move, did not make a sound. It simply watched me with those glowing eyes. And I watched it back, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly that my fingers ached. And then, more slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. The snow compressed under its weight with a soft crunch. Then another step. It was moving toward me, not quickly, not aggressively, but with the same measured, careful pace I had seen on the trail camera. My body screamed at me to run, to get back inside, to put distance between myself and this thing that should not exist. But I could not move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by something that was equal parts fear and fascination. It stopped about 10 feet away, close enough that I could see the details of its face, the broad and flat nose, the heavy brow, the almost human shape of the skull beneath the fur. Close enough that I could hear its breathing, deep and rhythmic, like the bellows of some great engine. The smell was overpowering now, filling my nostrils, making my head swim. And then it did something I did not expect. It tilted its head slightly, the way a dog does when it hears an unfamiliar sound. There was something almost gentle in the gesture, something curious. It was not threatening me. It was not preparing to attack. It was simply looking at me, studying me, trying to understand what I was. I do not remember making the decision to raise the shotgun. My body moved on instinct, some deep survival mechanism taking over. I lifted the weapon and pointed it at the creature's chest. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the barrel steady. The creature looked at the gun, then back at my face. It did not flinch, did not step back. It just stood there, watching, waiting, as if it understood what the gun was and simply did not care. I pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the stillness, the recoil slamming into my shoulder and nearly knocking me off my feet. The sound echoed across the frozen landscape, bouncing off the trees and rolling away into the distance. I stumbled backward, catching myself before I fell, and raised the flashlight again. The creature was gone. The snow where it had been standing was unmarked except for its tracks, huge, deep impressions leading back into the woods. No blood, no sign that the shot had even touched it. Just tracks, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, gasping, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The flashlight beam wavered in my shaking hand. I looked down at the shotgun, at the spent shell lying in the snow, and then back at the tree line. Nothing, no movement, no sound. Just the empty, frozen forest and the fading echo of the gunshot. I do not remember walking back to the house. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was lying on the porch, the flashlight still clutched in one hand, the shotgun beside me. The sun was rising, pale and cold, casting long shadows across the snow. My body was stiff with cold, my face numb, my fingers barely able to move. I struggled to my feet, every muscle protesting, and looked out at the yard. The tracks were still there. Huge, deep impressions in the snow, leading from the tree line to the place where the creature had stood, then back again. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the woods. And there, near the fence, I saw something else. Smaller tracks, my own, leading from the house to the antenna and back. But they were confused, wandering as if I had been walking in circles, as if I had not been entirely in control of my own movements. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to remember what had happened. The creature, the confrontation, the gunshot, but the memories were fragmented, dreamlike, as if I had experienced them through a fog. Had I really fired the gun? Had I really stood face to face with that thing in the snow? Or had it been some kind of hallucination, a breakdown brought on by fear and isolation? But the evidence was there. The bent antenna, the tracks in the snow, the spent shell, and the smell, that thick, musky odor that still clung to my clothes. Undeniable proof that something had been there. I tried calling the authorities one more time. The sheriff's office, the ranger station, anyone who might listen. But the words sounded insane even to me. A creature in the woods, 8 feet tall, covered in fur, bending metal with its bare hands. They told me to rest, told me to take care of myself, told me that the isolation was getting to me, that I should consider moving into town, at least for the winter. One of the deputies said, with barely concealed amusement, that maybe I had seen the same thing that fed the boy all those weeks ago. I hung up. There was no point in trying to make them understand. They had their version of reality, and I had mine, and the two would never meet. So I stopped trying. I stopped calling. I stopped hoping that someone would believe me or help me, or do anything except dismiss what I knew to be true. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the snow-covered yard. The tracks were still visible, though the wind had begun to fill them in. By morning they would be gone, erased by the natural processes of the world as if nothing had ever happened. But I would remember. I would carry the memory of those glowing eyes, that massive silhouette, that moment of recognition between two beings who should never have met. And I would know with absolute certainty that I was no longer alone in these woods, that something else lived here, something old and patient and unknowable, and that it was still watching. I am writing these words at the same table where Marjorie used to embroider tablecloths on Sunday afternoons. The wood is worn smooth by decades of use, scarred with the small marks of ordinary life, coffee rings, knife scratches, the faint indentations where she would press too hard with her pen when writing letters to her sister. The light through the window is thin and grey, filtered through a fog so thick that the forest has disappeared, reduced to vague shapes that drift in and out of visibility like memories half forgotten. It has been 3 months since that night in the snow. Winter has begun to loosen its grip, and the thaw has started. The creek is running again, swollen with meltwater, and the snow has receded to shadowed patches beneath the trees. The birds have returned, filling the mornings with their calls, and yesterday I saw the first green shoots pushing up through the dead leaves in the yard, life returning as it always does, indifferent to what has happened or what will happen. No one speaks about the boy anymore. The story has faded into the background noise of local legend, another strange tale to be told in bars and hunting camps, half believed and half dismissed. Some people say he made it all up, that he was coached by parents looking for attention or compensation. Others say he was delirious from hypothermia, that his mind filled in the gaps with whatever it could find. A few people, the ones who have spent enough time in these woods to know that not everything can be explained, simply nod and say nothing. They know. They have seen their own versions of the inexplicable, Lisa, their own moments when the world revealed something beneath its surface, and they know better than to speak of it. I have made my own peace with what happened. Or perhaps peace is not the right word. Acceptance, maybe. Understanding that there are things in this world that exist beyond the boundaries of what we are willing to acknowledge, that the forest is older and stranger than we pretend it is, that there are spaces between the known and the unknown where something else lives, something that watches and waits and occasionally reaches across the divide to touch our lives in ways we cannot comprehend. Since that night, I have started leaving food at the edge of the woods. Berries mostly. Raspberries when I can find them. Blackberries. Apples from the old tree behind the shed. I set them out in the evening, near the place where the tracks disappeared into the forest, and by morning they are gone. No animals leave traces like that. No deer or raccoon takes food so cleanly, without disturbing the ground around it. Something comes in the night, takes what I have left and vanishes back into the trees. I do not know why I do this. It is not out of fear, though fear is certainly part of what I feel. It is something else. A gesture, perhaps. A recognition that we share this space, this creature and I, and that there are rules to such sharing, rituals that must be observed. Marjorie used to say that respect was the first principle of living in the wilderness. Respect for the land, for the animals, for the forces you cannot control. I think she would understand what I am doing, even if I cannot fully explain it myself. Some nights, I still hear the footsteps. They are less frequent now, more distant, but they are there. I no longer go to the window to look. I no longer reach for the shotgun or the flashlight. I simply listen, acknowledge their presence, and return to whatever I was doing. There is a kind of companionship in it, strange as that sounds. I am alone, but I am not alone. There is something out there that knows I exist, that watches over this small piece of forest where our lives intersect. It is not comfort exactly, horror, but it is connection. And after years of isolation, even this peculiar connection feels like something worth holding on to. I know what people would say if they read these words. They would say I have gone mad. That isolation has broken me. That I am inventing stories to fill the emptiness of my days. They would point to my age, my solitude, the fact that I live in the middle of nowhere with no one to talk to and nothing to do but think. They would say I need help. Medical attention, someone to watch over me and make sure I do not hurt myself. And maybe they would be right. Maybe this is all a construction of a mind worn down by loneliness and grief. Maybe the creature is just a manifestation of something broken inside me, a symbol my psyche has created to make sense of the senselessness of living. But I do not think so. The evidence is too concrete. The tracks in the mud and snow, the bent antenna, the footage from the trail camera, deleted but never forgotten, the smell that clings to my clothes after certain nights, the food that disappears from the edge of the woods with a regularity that defies explanation. These are not fantasies. They are facts. And facts have a weight that cannot be dismissed, no matter how inconvenient they are. The hardest part is not the fear or the uncertainty. It is the isolation that comes from knowing something that cannot be shared. Truth, I have learned, is not a gift. It is a burden. It separates you from the common experience of humanity, places you on the outside of the comfortable narratives people tell themselves about how the world works. When you see something that should not exist, when you experience something that defies explanation, you become a kind of exile from normal life. You carry the knowledge alone, unable to put it down and unable to make anyone else understand. And that is what I have become, an exile, a witness to something most people will never see and would never believe if they did. I live in the space between the known and the unknown, between the rational and the inexplicable. It is a lonely place, but it is also in its way a sacred one, because here, in this liminal space, the world is more than what it appears to be. It is deeper, stranger, more mysterious, and I have been allowed to see that, to experience it, even if the price is solitude and doubt. If someone finds this account after I am gone, I ask only that you do not laugh. Laughter is the last refuge of those who are afraid to believe. It is easier to mock than to consider, easier to dismiss than to accept that the world might be larger and more complicated than we want it to be. But the truth does not care whether we believe in it. It exists regardless, patient and indifferent, waiting for us to catch up. I think about the boy sometimes, about what he experienced in those 3 days alone in the woods, about what he saw and felt and understood, and I wonder if he too carries the burden of that knowledge, if he lies awake at night remembering the eyes that watched him from the darkness, the hands that offered him food, the presence that kept him alive when he should have died. I wonder if he too has learned that some truths cannot be spoken, that some experiences exist beyond the reach of language. There is a comfort in that thought, that I am not the only one who knows, that somewhere out there, a boy is growing up with the memory of something impossible, something that will shape him in ways he may never fully understand. We are connected, he and I, by this shared knowledge, this common experience of the inexplicable, and that connection, tenuous as it is, makes the isolation a little more bearable. Outside, the fog is beginning to lift. I can see the tree line now, the dark mass of the forest emerging from the grey. Somewhere in those trees, I know, the creature is moving through its own life, following its own rhythms, existing in a reality that occasionally brushes against mine, but remains fundamentally separate. We are two beings occupying the same space, aware of each other but unable to truly meet. And perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps some distances are meant to be maintained, some mysteries left unsolved. I do not know how much longer I have. At 73, Caius, with the winter I have just survived, I'm aware that every day is borrowed time. When my time comes, whether it is in a year or 10 years or tomorrow, I hope it happens here in this house, surrounded by the forest that has been my life. And I hope that when they find me, if they find me, they will also find these words and understand that I was not mad, not broken, but simply awake to something that most people sleep through. The creature is still out there. I know this with absolute certainty. In the deep woods, beyond the reach of roads and houses and the noise of human life, it moves through the shadows, ancient and patient and unknowable. And every night, when I set out the berries at the edge of the forest, I am acknowledging its presence, paying my respects to something that was here long before me and will be here long after I am gone. This is not a story with an ending. It is simply an account of what I have seen and experienced and come to accept. The creature is real. The forest is deeper than it appears, and the world, despite all our efforts to explain it and categorize it and make it comfortable, remains fundamentally mysterious. That mystery is both terrible and beautiful. It isolates and illuminates. It takes away the comfortable certainties of ordinary life and replaces them with something stranger and more profound. I would not wish this knowledge on anyone, but I would not give it up either, because in seeing what others cannot see, in accepting what others refuse to believe, I have touched something essential, something true. And in the end, that is all any of us can hope for, to see clearly, to witness honestly, to accept what is rather than what we wish were so. The fog has lifted completely now. The forest stands clear and green in the afternoon light. And somewhere in those trees I know the creature is watching, waiting, as am I,